Sticky positioning is relatively new to CSS. It allows us to have a header to stick to its parent element. So in the last lesson, we looked at fixed positioning, where it was fixed to the entire page, your entire viewport actually. And we just made a header that scrolled all the way down the page with us. And it looked a lot like this. Actually, it looked exactly like this because this is what we wrote. Now sticky can do essentially the same thing. So fixed, we can say this is sticky. And you can see as I scroll up and down the page, it stays with me as well. However, the difference between sticky and fixed is going to be here no matter what. And even if I scroll down the page where there's no extra content, it's going to stay there. Whereas with sticky, it's going to be sticky to its parent element. So let's go ahead and create an example here. We have this box, and let's select that box. And let's do display, sticky. Okay, so I just wrote a bunch of stuff here from that last lesson. I gave the body a margin of 0, padding of 0, default height of 3000. Actually, we don't need that either. And the box is positioned sticky, background color is the same as the last lesson, border bottom has a little bit of padding. Let's go ahead and get rid of that one. And when I refresh the page, we just have this bar here. Now let's go ahead and throw this inside of a parent element. So we have this box, and then we can have a paragraph with lorem in here. Copy, paste, 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 paste. And if I zoom this in, we're going to see that it's no longer sticky. And so yeah, it's not sticky, but we can make this sticky. This actually requires another property here. So because it's positioned sticky, it also needs to have top, right, bottom, left. Usually it's just top. We give this a top property here. Let's say 0, and that just tells it where to be sticky. Otherwise, it doesn't know. And so now when I scroll down the page, it stays sticky. Now, that's part 1 of 2. The second part is to make it sticky only for this particular section where there's all this stuff in here. So let's go ahead and add a style on here. Style to have a background color of red and a color of white. And refresh the page. And we're going to see, oh, I forgot to make that sticky by adding top 0. So stick to the top. There we go. So now it's sticky. Let's add another section underneath this blue, and let's change that header as well. So let's go ahead and basically copy this entire thing. And I just collapsed that with a little arrow here. And let's go underneath. And this one's going to be background color of blue. And let's change what's in here. So let's say section 2 of our box. Now we're reusing CSS. And in the top one here, let's do section 1. Okay, let's scroll back up to the top of the page, refresh. Oh, we can't see that color very well. Color is equal to black. That's better. So this is section 1, and as I scroll down, it's going to stay there. And section 2, woo, gets bumped out of the way. And then there's section 2. And as I scroll up, woo, section 1 comes back into play. I really like this part. That's really nice. That used to be really hard for us to do, but it comes default with CSS 3 these days, which is really, really nice. So that is what sticky is. Now in summary, you need position sticky, you need a top value. So we've got a top value of 0, and all we did here was we have a parent element. I have some inline CSS here, not the greatest way to do things, but it really drove the whole example home. So we have a parent container here, and then inside of it, we have position sticky, and it's going to be sticky around all of this content because it's sticky to its parent element. Now, what I would like you to do is give this a shot because this is really important for making websites look and act really, really nice on mobile devices, which is part of responsive web development, and that's part of more advanced CSS. So knowing position sticky is going to be very, very helpful for you. So please give this a shot. If you get stuck, don't forget you can always ask questions in the Learning to Code Facebook group. Overflow is when you can constrict an element's width and height, but then you sort of run the risk of your content sort of like overflowing to the outside of it. In this lesson, I'm going to provide an example and how you can sort of create like a scroll bar inside of your boxes. Now we have a few different options. We can choose to hide the overflow. We can let the user scroll either left and right, up and down, or just up and down. More often than not, we really just want the user to scroll inside of a box up and down. So let's go ahead and add some content to this box. Now, I just have this regular box. We've been working with this throughout the rest of this course, or up until this part of the course anyways. Let's add some lorem ipsum in here, and let's add another line and another line. And let's just make this really long. And the idea here is that this box is supposed to be 300 pixels wide by 300 pixels tall. And this is going to be more content than that box can contain. So if I refresh this page and zoom in, oh, it's actually not quite enough. Let's go ahead and copy this just a couple more times. Here we go. And the idea here is if I zoom out, we have this box and our content is breaking out of it. Now, the reason this happens is because we have set a width and a height. We said specifically with this one, the height of this box is 300 pixels. And it needs to be 300 pixels because maybe that's what our designer said. Our designer said it has to be 300 pixels, cannot be any bigger. It's not allowed to grow, otherwise it's going to look a little weird. So what we can do is add this little scroll bar to the right side here. And we do this quite easily. So on our box class, all we have to do is say overflow. And let's change this to an HTML document again. I write a lot of Django, so my HTML files automatically default to a Django template. Yours should automatically default to HTML by default as soon as you have the .html extension in your file name. So overflow, we have a few different options here. And this is really great. All I did was move my mouse there and it says syntax, visible, hidden, clip, scroll, auto. Let's do hidden first. And so if we wanted to hide that content, hidden will hide that extra content. There is actually more content down here. And we can actually see when I hover over this text that this text takes up that entire section, but it's being hidden. We can also say visible, and that's just the default. That's what we saw originally. And then we can do auto. And this is the one you're going to want more often than not, is scroll back here or flip back here. Overflow auto. And when I refresh, it allows me to scroll up and down just like that. Now, this is going to be really important if you're creating an area like a product feature list and you don't want it to take up the entire page and make your user scroll forever. They can choose on a mobile device to just scroll within this box. Or if you have a frequently asked question section, same thing. You don't want it to take up the entire page. If there's like 100 questions, you might just want it to take up like 300 pixels and they can scroll through the answers in here. So that is overflowing. Go ahead, give this a shot. Remember, you need to set a height. You need to have more content than what your element can currently hold with that height, and then set the overflow to auto, and that will just give you this little bar like that. To horizontally center an element, we need to use the block element so that it can reserve the entire width of its sort of section, and it tries to reserve like the entire width. I guess I'll demonstrate this in just a second. And then we can use margin left auto, margin right auto. And so all I have here is a block, and I don't want this to be inline block. I want this to be block, which is the default, so I don't actually need that for a div. And so I've got 4 pixel solid blue, min width and max width. Let's just change that to a width and a height. I copied the wrong file, and that's okay. It's easy enough to change. So width of 400 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And when I open this element or this page in my browser, we can see that I have this box. Now let's say I wanted it to be right in the center. What I can do is I can say down here, and I'll make this a bit bigger, margin left auto, and that's going to automatically apply all of the margin it can. So we actually moved it to the right. That's kind of cool. But if we wanted it to be in the center, we do margin right auto, and this balances it on either side. And a shortcut you're often going to see me do is something like margin. Let's say the top is going to be 50 pixels and left and right are going to be auto. This is top, this is right, this is bottom, this is left. And so we can toggle these off because they're not being used whatsoever. And now we have margin all the way around and our element is centered. Now why this is important? Because eventually you're going to need to be able to center an element based on its margin. Not just the text, you want to center it based on its margin, so it's always centered. Now it's at this point you're probably wondering, wow, okay, this is cool. We're doing all these things, but it doesn't really look very nice. And the problem with learning CSS is you need to learn these smaller components, these little tips and tricks, before we can actually start making something really beautiful. We need to know how all these small components work together. And so this is how we center something in the center of our page. And let's just there we go. It's in the center of our page using margins. Go ahead, give that a shot. When you're ready, let's head on over to the next lesson. All right, let's take a look at advanced selectors. We have a few different selectors we can work with. Actually, there's a ton of selectors in CSS, but we're going to be working with descendant selectors, child selectors, adjacent selectors, and general sibling selectors. So let's go ahead and create a bunch of boxes here. And I'm going to put this in a parent with an ID called parent. And let's just move that up. And let's create all these boxes. And let's style these boxes as well. So we have dot box, and we're going to give this a height of 20 pixels and a border of 1 pixel solid blue. And that's just going to create a bunch of these stacked on top of each other. And this is what we see on our page. This is not the nicest thing ever, but this is a selector lesson. We don't need it to look good. We don't need it to do too much other than select what we currently want it to select. So what we could do is, as a general descendant selector, we just use a space. And we learned about this in CSS 101. So we could say parent, that's the parent ID, that's going to match this. And then all of the box children in here. And we do this with a space. And so when I save this, go back here, and I refresh, we're going to see that nothing changes. And that's expected. But all we're saying is, if there was a box outside of this, let's do this, box, this isn't a blue bordered box. We can see that this box, even if we right click and inspect, has the class of box, but it's not being styled. And so that's a descendant selector. Likewise, we can also do just child selectors. So instead of explicitly saying descendant selector, we could say child selector, use the greater than sign. So this is your parent, this is your child selector, and this is your child. And in fact, we can actually see that when we go here in VS Code, it uses the same symboling here. So we have div.box, that's our class and our element. And then we have that greater than sign that goes to our parent, and that's going to do the exact same thing as a descendant selector. And when I refresh, yeah, you see nothing changes. Now we can do this thing where we select adjacent selectors. So we can now say parent, and then I want to select all of the boxes plus more boxes. And we can say background color is equal to red. And so this one here is our adjacent selector. And it's just going to select elements that are, I guess, adjacent to it. And so it doesn't select that first one, but it selects the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, all the way down. And so that is an adjacent selector. It's not going to select the first one, it's going to select the next ones. And then we have this general sibling selector. So we can select everything in our parent, select our boxes, and then we have this tilde. And so on my keyboard, it's right beside the number 1 at the top left of my keyboard. It might be different depending on if you have an international keyboard, but a generic English keyboard is right beside the number 1, and it's this tilde. Well, I guess that's a tilde? I can't actually remember. It's a squiggly line anyways. And then we can say dot box, and let's change the background color of this. Background color, nope, not background attachment, background color to black. And this isn't going to work because I spelled parent. It's supposed to be parent. Save, refresh, and it selects all the similar ones. And the idea here is that in my inspect tool, in our developer tools, it's going to select that first one, and then it says, oh, actually, plus all the other ones down the road. So it's kind of two different ways of doing the same thing. Now, what I would like you to do is go ahead and give this a shot. One thing you're going to want to be careful of is I am selecting the parent, then the child box to style all of these with a blue element. You notice how this box down here is not being selected whatsoever. What I can also do is go ahead and get rid of parent. And when I refresh, you can see that my blue box, or my non-bordered box, now has a blue border, but it doesn't have any of the black background. Or if I comment this out, they're now red. So I'm just going to undo that. But one thing to be careful of is this thing called specificity. So if you're saying select the parent ID and then select the child element here called box and give it a height of 20 pixels and a border of 1 pixel solid blue, then your next selector to select these exact same boxes needs to be exactly this specific. Otherwise, watch this. And this is a crash course on specificity and how it can be a nightmare in CSS. So that background is now black, but if I go ahead and get rid of this, it's going to effectively ignore this because this is more specific. Refresh the page, it ignored the black background and it went with the specific one. So it matches. It's saying select the parent ID, then the box classes, parent ID, box classes. There's no parent ID, it's just saying any box with another box beside it. So go ahead, give this a shot, play around with this. Feel free to experiment with specificity as well. If you get a little bit lost with specificity, honestly, you don't need to know it right now. But if you're a keener and you really want to know about specificity, you can always go and Google that a little bit as well. That could be some additional supplementary homework if you're really feeling like you want to learn CSS at 150%. Pseudo classes are a way to link states. We can control the CSS styling when you hover over an element. We learned about that in CSS 101, and that is a pseudo selector, or pseudo class, I believe it's actually called. But with other pseudo selectors, we can also select elements that should not have a particular class, or we can even select the exact element on a page using the nth child selector. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at hover, nth child, and the not selector. Pseudo selectors. Let's talk about not, nth child, and hover. So a couple of lessons ago, we made all of these boxes. Let's go ahead and mostly get rid of this. And when I load up this page, it's just a bunch of blue lines. So it's just a bunch of divs, and we can see all of these divs in here. And so I've got a parent element. It has an ID called parent, so we know it's the parent. And a bunch of boxes. Now a pseudo selector will use just a regular colon to use this, or to activate the selector. There's a lot of them, but in this lesson we're really only going to work on not, nth child, and hover. And it looks like this. Dot box, colon, and then your pseudo class name. So this one is called hover, and we can change this background color to gray if we wanted to. And let's zoom in here. And when I hover over these, it changes the background color. No, it doesn't just have to be the background color we can change. We can change the border color. We can change the font size. We can change the font family. We can change literally everything. It works the exact same way, but all we're saying here is select all the classes of box. So all of these in here. And then when you put your mouse over it, when you hover over it, what is it going to do? That is a pseudo selector. Now we learned about this in CSS 101 real quick. Let's go ahead and use something a little more advanced. So we can now say box. Let's use the not, and actually see there's a lot of them in here. We're not going to go through all of these. There are just so many, and frankly, most of them aren't typically used, but they are supported. So let's do box, colon, not, and then what we do in here is we give it another selector. What should it not be selecting? So don't select me. Let's go ahead and copy that and throw that into, like, I don't know, the third one. And let's finish this off. Let's do a background color of blue. So these should all now have a blue border, a blue background. When you hover over it, they're all going to turn gray. However, the box not, don't select me, that's this one, is not going to have a blue background color. So let's go ahead and refresh, and you can see it selects this one right in the middle. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that CSS, like most programming languages, works from the top to the bottom. So we said, give it a background color of gray when we hover. But then we said, if the box is not, don't select me class, doesn't have this one, then change that background color to blue. And when we go back here, we're going to see that nothing is actually happening except this one. In order to fix this, we just select that and just move it above. Save, refresh, and now it works for us the way we want it to work. Beautiful. Beauty, beauty, beauty. Okay, let's say we wanted to select a particular one. Now, there's going to be a time in the future, at some point when you're working on a website, that you have all of this HTML, and you're not going to be able to edit that HTML. Maybe you're working with a framework like Django, and you need to be able to just work with straight HTML. This is very, very important. This is one of the key skills in CSS, is you need to be able to not touch your HTML and still select what you need to select. So let's go ahead and select like this box here. Let's say select me. And let's change that color to white on all boxes. Color is going to be white so we can read it. There we go. We want this one to be selected, and then we don't want any of the other ones to be selected. Now the problem is this one is the same as this one, is the same as this one, is the same as this one, and the bottom three. They're all identical. They all live inside of the parent. There's nothing unique about them. How do we select this? Now we can select this with the nth child selector. And so what we can say is select all of our boxes, then do nth child, and it takes curly brace, not curly braces, but parentheses. And this nth child takes a number. And so which one do we want to select? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we throw the number 5 in there. And let's change this background color. It's already blue. That's not going to do anything. Let's change this background color to yellow. And let's change this color to black, the text color to black. And when we refresh our page, it selects just this one. So we know that there are a set amount of boxes. And we said, oh, we just need to select this one, but we can't touch the HTML. We can say, skip 1, 2, 3, 4, select number 5 with the nth child selector, and then apply our styling. Now this is really important because this gets into advanced selectors, and this is going to help you out immensely in the future at some point when you're working with a designer, most likely. So when you're working with your web designer is going to say, here's a bunch of stuff. You might be working with a backend dev. Backend dev says, okay, we're going to make this work in Django, and it's going to have a bunch of checkboxes, for example. But we want the third one, the third item in the checkbox to have a border around it so it really sticks out, so people are more likely to click that one. We could do that with nth child. We can make sure that when you hover over something, things change. We can make sure that you don't select certain elements. You can select all of them except certain ones. Pseudo elements are similar in syntax to pseudo classes or selectors, what we learned in that last lesson. The difference is how it acts. So it looks very similar, but it is slightly different. So in this particular lesson, we're going to be using 2 colons. So we could select a box, use 2 colons, and then whatever the selector is called, or not in this lesson, but in the next couple of lessons, we're going to be learning about these pseudo selectors. They're not pseudo selectors, these are actually pseudo elements. So what we did before was a pseudo class or a pseudo selector of hover. This time we're going to say select the box, and then we could do before or dot box colon colon after. And this is going to do different things for us. Now, before and after is what we're going to be learning about first. These are really, really interesting elements because what it does is, and we'll go more in depth about this in the particular lessons, but it's actually going to create elements. It's going to do certain things that HTML should be doing. So CSS is sort of stepping over its boundary here and getting into the world of HTML. Now, another difference is these don't really have actions, whereas like hover is, you're hovering over something. You're actually doing something. It's going to take some sort of hover event. You put your mouse over it and it can change. Whereas like before and after, these aren't really designed to do that, although you can absolutely do that. But these are going to be basically adding HTML elements to your page. So let's go ahead and jump into before and after. Before and after pseudo elements are a lot like inline HTML elements, but we don't have to write any HTML for these. So we can target certain things on our page, and we can basically add more HTML, or at least add fake HTML, and then add a bunch of styling to it. So we don't actually have to modify our HTML at all. So a good example of this is a box. And if I go back to my browser, this is what the box looks like. It's center of the page. It has a black border. It's just a 300 by 300 pixel box. Now, what we can say is select that box, and then before, we can do all sorts of stuff to it. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add some content. This uses the content property, and typically we just add an empty space in there, and that just tells the browser, hey, look, there's supposed to be an element in here, and you know, like when you write an empty div, it doesn't show up on your page. Same thing, but we're going to add a space, and that makes sure it does show up on the page. Then we can do a display. So we can say display block, and then we can give a border of 10 pixels, solid, red. And let's see what this looks like so far. This is not going to be perfect, but it's going to be pretty close. And at this point, actually, as soon as I refresh this page, we're going to see, yep. So we have something in there. That's cool. And we can actually go into our inspect element here and select it. We can do all sorts of stuff with it. We can now actually edit this CSS right in our developer tools. Let's go ahead and give this a width of 100%. Let's see what this does. And at this point, we're just going to experiment. You can see that it gives it a width of 100%. And it's bulging out because of the borders, the black borders, that is. Let's say we want to give it a height. 100%. Let's see if this is honored as well. Okay, not bad, not bad. Let's say we wanted to move this. So let's get into some positioning. Let's do position relative on the entire box itself. But then in the before pseudo element, this fake element that doesn't actually exist on the page, there's no HTML here. We can't edit the HTML. We can say, let's move this. So let's move this to the top right. And so we can say position absolute. And we know that this is going to work because its parent selector is using position relative. Its parent element is using position relative. We do position absolute. Let's do top minus 10 pixels, and let's do left minus 10 pixels. And we're going to see this sort of bumps up here. Oh, actually, that's because we have borders in there. Yep, 10 pixels solid red border, so we just overlapped it. Let's go ahead and do 30 instead. There we go. Now you can actually see that this before is on top of this black border. And a better example of this is if I do background color is equal to black on the box, not the pseudo element before. We can see that the red is outlined on top of it. Now, if we wanted to change that, we absolutely could. We could do, and this is part of positioning, we could say Z index -1. And that layers it behind. Now, likewise, we can do the same thing, but with after. So every element can have a before and after. We can do box, colon, after. And we're going to select this box, but we're going to create an after element instead of a before element. Let's go ahead and copy most of this stuff. It's going to be very, very similar. We could actually group these selectors together if we wanted to. Let's change this from solid red to solid blue. And instead of top, let's do bottom and right. And let's see how this turns out for us. It's not going to be exactly what you expect, but it's going to show something, and we can adjust from there. Okay, cool. So we have these on top, these before and after elements, and they're behind. Let's go ahead and get rid of that Z index, or we can make it a positive Z index of like 1 or let's say 10. And that just layers it on top. So now we have this nice little layering. What happens if we get rid of bottom and right? Okay, so right after the element, it's going to be right inside. You can actually see that there's this border here, this black border, that 10 pixel border. It's right on the inside. What if we said top and left are the same as the before? It moves it exactly where we expect it to go. So now as one more example, let's go ahead and get rid of this top left. Let's go get rid of this top left. And these are going to be the exact same. We can't actually see these anymore, but we can select them. So we have a before, and we can say before is going to be top minus 30 pixels, and left. And I'll just move that up in the video here. Minus 30 pixels. Okay. And we can select the after, and we can do the same thing, but different. Bottom, minus 30 pixels. Right, minus 30 pixels. And that just gives us this nice little layering effect. Now let's look at a real world example. This is really, really cool, but this is not really a real world example. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create an HR in here, just a horizontal rule, and I'm gonna create a new link. So an A element, it's not gonna go anywhere, and give this a border. Let's go ahead and put some lorem in here as well. And throw this right in the center. And so that undid my stuff up there. That's totally okay. And when I zoom in here, I'm gonna zoom in real good here. I'm gonna zoom in at 200%. Let's say we wanna give this a border. Let's get rid of this default styling and let's give this a proper border. And when you hover over it, the border gets bigger. So what we can do is we can select our A element, say text decoration, none. Let's do just nothing in there. Let's change the color to black. And let's see what this looks like. Okay, cool, it fits in. You see it's a link, it fits in, we can't tell it's a link until we hover over it. What we can do now is we can say, hey, A element, before, let's do content with a space, width is equal to 100%, height is equal to, let's say, 4 pixels. This gives us a background color. And I'll just move that up into the center of the video. The background color is going to be blue. And let's see what this looks like. Nothing yet. Why is that? Well, we need to give this a position. So let's do, on our main element here, position relative. And then on the before, let's do position absolute. Bottom 0. Left 0 has a width of 100%, so this should now show up for us. There we go. So that doesn't actually look very good at all. And that's not really the point here. The point is to show you that we can give this a border. Now this is no different than border bottom, what did we say here? 4 pixels, solid blue. But now on hover, we can start to match, mix and match these. We can say a hover before, and let's change that height to 14 pixels. Give that a refresh, and look at that. Now it covers the text. You can't actually see the text in there anymore. And instead what we can do is say, always be below the text, be underneath it, like we're layering a piece of paper on top of another piece of paper. So we can say index is going to be -1. By default, all Z indexes or Z indexes are at 0. We're going to say, throw this just behind this text. And now, bam. Well, we still can't really see that, so let's change that from blue to yellow. There we go. That's looking a little better. That's still very hard to see in the video. Let's do red. That's a lot better. And so now we have this pseudo element using a hover state, and we're actually modifying this element itself. So if we go in here and expand our A, we can see that there's a before. And another cool thing we can do is we can click that ... that ellipsis, and we can do for state hover. And that hovers this state for us as if we put our mouse over it permanently. And then we can click this before and we can see what's going on in here, including the A selector using a hover pseudo class using a before pseudo element. Now, what I would like you to do is give this a shot. This is very, very important because this is part of advanced CSS. We are getting into the meaty parts of CSS. So give this a shot. Try creating a link, try creating boxes with before and after elements. With a pseudo element selector, we can target the first letter of an element. We can also target the first line of an element. So let's go ahead and create a paragraph in here with a bunch of lorem. And we're going to put a lot of lorem in here. And it's all going to be in a single paragraph. And I'm going to put it on multiple lines just to keep my code clean, but it's going to look like one paragraph on the page. So if we go here, okay, too small, let's zoom in. And let's say this is like, we're writing a website, or we're coding a website for a newspaper. or some sort of magazine, and we want that first letter to be huge. We can target that. We can say in our styling here, target the P element, and we can do first letter, and then we can do font size of, let's do something big. Let's do like 50 pixels. And this is going to make this L, just the very first L, not the other ones, just this very first one really big. Let's go ahead. Okay, looks all right. It's bigger, but we want the text to sort of wrap around it. And we know we can do wraparound things with float. Float left. And this is very, very important to know, but it's also something we learned in CSS 101. So if you're not familiar with float, you might want to get familiar with float. It's very useful in certain cases like this. And so that L is still a little too big, but what we can do is we can select this P, go down to the bottom. Nope, it's not in there because it's not an element. Pseudo, there we go, first letter element. Let's go ahead and change that font size. And I'll just adjust this to, I don't know. Let's just keep making this smaller till it looks, half decent. Yeah, something like that. And then we can also add a margin of like 50 pixels if we wanted it to really stick out. We can add a margin of 5 pixels to make it a little more smooth looking. And I'll just move this up. And this is the first letter selector. So let's go ahead and add that margin in there as well. Margin 5 pixels. Now we can also select the first line, and it's not going to be necessarily this line of code. It's going to be this line. And that's going to depend on your browser. So we're getting into something a little more responsive here. And so let's go ahead and say P, first line, and let's do font weight of bold. And let's save, refresh, and now it's bold. Now, the nice thing about this is it's always going to be that first line. You can see it's just the first 4 letters here. That's really hard to see. I apologize about that. But if I do this, it's always that first line, no matter how much text there is. It's always that first line. So that is your first letter and your first line pseudo element selectors, or pseudo selector. And honestly, you're not going to use this too often, but it is good to know that it is possible to do. So I'm not going to give you homework for this one, but just tuck this in your back pocket, save it for later. Know that this is completely possible in case you're ever working with a client who has an article style website like a magazine or a newspaper.